For 4,000 years, a woman lay in the sand of a Chinese desert with her eyelashes still on her face. Not her skull, not a shadow of her shape pressed into the dirt. Her actual eyelashes, her actual skin, the actual felt hat, still sitting on her actual hair, red and gold, the color of dried wheat, in the exact center of Asia, 1,000 years before anyone the history books account for ever walked into that basin. For a century, every scientist who looked at her face agreed on one thing before they'd even finished examining it. She didn't belong there. She had to have come from somewhere else, somewhere far to the west, carried across half a continent by some migration nobody had mapped yet. Then in 2021, her own DNA was finally read, and it said something else entirely, something that didn't just change where she came from. It erased the question itself. The desert she was found in is called the Taklamakan, and the name itself carries a warning built directly into the word. It translates, roughly, as the place you enter but never leave, which isn't poetry so much as a practical piece of advice passed down by people who watched others walk into it and simply not come back out. It sits inside the Tarim Basin, the largest inland basin in China, a vast bowl of sand and salt, sealed off almost completely by mountains on every side. Somewhere inside that bowl lies the dried, crusted-over bed of a lake called Lop Nur, a body of water that essentially gave up and died, evaporating into dust so thoroughly that the Chinese state would later choose the site for nuclear testing precisely because nothing and no one lived there anymore. The mountains lock the rain out. The salt in the ground is thick enough that almost nothing grows in it. Every single feature of that landscape points toward erasure, toward a place built to destroy anything left inside it, and yet it has preserved human bodies better than almost anywhere else on the planet. The reason has nothing to do with embalming, nothing to do with ritual, nothing to do with anyone intending to preserve anything at all. It's chemistry. The air out there is punishingly dry, and the soil is saturated with salt, and together those two conditions pull the moisture out of a body laid into that ground until the flesh simply desiccates in place, slowly, completely and entirely, by accident. These aren't mummies in the way people usually picture that word from Egypt. Nobody prepared these bodies. Nobody removed the organs or wrapped the limbs in linen or painted a coffin with spells meant to carry a soul into the next world. There was no priesthood standing over these graves directing the process. The desert did the work on its own, with no intention behind it whatsoever, drawing the water out of a body so completely that eyelashes survived, that the fine lines in someone's skin survived, that the small hairs on a forearm survived for 4,000 years after that arm stopped moving for the last time. That is the strange, almost cruel bargain of the Taklamakan. The exact same conditions that make it uninhabitable for the living are the exact conditions that keep the dead intact. Out in that basin, 4,000 years takes almost nothing at all. And that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because a bare skeleton can only give you measurements, a rough estimate of age, a guess at height, a guess at the rest. A body that still has its hair on it, still wrapped in the actual cloth someone chose to bury it in, gives you the person, what they wore, how they cut their hair, someone who loved them or feared them or simply respected the ritual of the moment, chose to lay down beside them on the day they went into the ground for the last time. The first of these bodies to seize the world's attention surfaced in 1980, and nobody was even looking for it when it happened. A team of Chinese archaeologists working near Lop Nur was there filming a documentary about the Silk Road, nothing more ambitious than that. When they found her barely a meter beneath the surface, a woman wrapped in wool and felt. Dating placed her at roughly 1,800 years before the Common Era. Her face was intact. Her expression was intact. She had been lying in that sand for close to 4,000 years, and somehow, impossibly, she still had an expression on her face. They called her the Beauty of Lulan, and her photograph traveled around the entire world, becoming the single image most people associate with the Tarim Basin to this day. And as striking as she was, she turned out not to be the important discovery. The richer find, the one that would eventually turn a haunting photograph into a problem the entire field couldn't put down for the next 40 years, was waiting much farther out, roughly 75 miles west and slightly south, deeper into open dune country, in a place you could only reach by crossing bare sand, with nothing on the horizon in any direction to steer by. That site is called Xiaohe, the Small River Cemetery, sometimes referred to by researchers as Urdek's necropolis. Nobody stumbles onto this place by accident. You have to already know it's there and be determined enough to go looking for it. Systematic excavation didn't begin until the early 2000s, and what it opened up turned out to be one of the strangest burial grounds ever documented anywhere on Earth. You see it before you even reach it, a forest of tall wooden posts standing up out of the sand, hundreds of them driven into a low mound rising out of an otherwise empty plain, some left plain, others carved into distinct shapes. And this is a point worth being careful about, because archaeologists have interpreted those carved shapes through the lens of burial symbolism, which is a reasonable interpretation, but still an interpretation rather than a confirmed fact. The posts themselves are real and undeniable. What they meant to the people who placed them is reconstruction, a best guess built from context, because nobody who drove those posts into the ground left behind a note explaining their purpose. Beneath the sand, the bodies themselves lie inside hollowed wooden coffins shaped unmistakably like boats and sealed with animal hide. Boats in the middle of one of the driest, most waterless deserts on the planet. Whatever else remains uncertain about this place, that particular detail was clearly not an accident. Someone deliberately hollowed those coffins into a curved vessel-like shape, a form built for water, and chose to lay their dead to rest inside them in one of the driest corners of the entire world. Among those graves was a woman researchers came to call the Beauty of Xiaohe. She still had her eyelashes. She still had her hair. She was found wearing a white felted wool hat, a woolen cloak, and boots lined with fur, and beside her body lay small pouches containing a plant called ephedra, tucked in close against her side. It's worth pausing on that detail specifically because it isn't simply a burial, it's an outfit. Someone chose that hat for her. Someone fitted those boots onto her feet, pulled that cloak closed around her body, and stood back to look at her one final time before the coffin was sealed and lowered into the ground. 4,000 years later, you're looking at the exact same arrangement that person left behind. But what made this necropolis genuinely extraordinary wasn't any single body, however striking. It was the sheer accumulation of them. Not one preserved woman, not a small handful, but hundreds of individuals, preserved down to individual strands of hair dressed in woven cloth, laid inside carefully shaped coffins beneath carved wooden posts, buried with evident care across multiple generations in a place that, by every reasonable measure, should have been entirely uninhabitable. This wasn't a temporary camp where a handful of unlucky travelers happened to die. This was a community with an actual cemetery, which means a community that had time, continuity, children who grew up and eventually buried their own parents the same way their parents had buried theirs before them. Whole generations lived out there in the salt and the wind and the sand, long enough to develop a genuine burial tradition and hold on to it across that entire span of time. And the ordinary everyday objects came up out of the ground right alongside them. Not gold, not thrones, not the kind of treasure that fills a museum hall and sells admission tickets. Baskets, cord, grain. Clothes with the actual weave pattern are still legible after 4 millennia. The unremarkable things a household uses constantly without ever thinking twice about them, sitting exactly where someone had set them down. Excavators had opened up one of the single best-preserved windows into the Bronze Age that exists anywhere on the planet. And instead of answering anything, every single body lifted out of that mound raised the exact same quiet, nagging problem the moment the sand was brushed away from it. They didn't look like the desert surrounding them. They didn't look like the people living in that region today. And they didn't look like the population's history records as having arrived there later either. They looked, to the researchers standing over them, as though they had wandered in from somewhere else entirely, and the desert had simply been keeping them in storage, waiting patiently for someone to eventually come along and explain them. For the next 4 decades, that's precisely what the field tried and failed to do. The problem sat directly in their faces. When these bodies were lifted from the sand, they didn't carry the features anyone expected to find in the geographic heart of Asia. Many were tall. Their eye sockets sat deep-set. Their noses ran high and narrow. Their hair ranged from flaxen blonde through to a deep rust-colored red, preserved strand by individual strand in that dry, salt-saturated ground. To the earliest researchers examining them, these features looked like they belonged to people from thousands of kilometers to the west, and yet here they were, buried in the driest corner of western China, sitting at the literal geographic center of an entire continent. And it bears repeating that these are not artistic reconstructions built up from a skull and a handful of measurements the way facial reconstructions usually work. This is not an artist's guess. The hair is the actual hair. The nose is the actual nose. You are looking directly at what the people standing at that graveside 4,000 years ago were themselves looking at, before anyone shoveled the sand back over the top of it. The clothing only deepened the mystery rather than resolving any part of it. These weren't people dressed in rough, scraped-together hides, thrown on purely for survival. They wore woven wool, some of it patterned with twill weaves and checkered designs that reminded early observers strongly of textiles produced far away in Central Europe. This was cloth that implied looms, that implied real skill, a tradition someone had deliberately learned from someone else and carried forward. There were carefully shaped felt hats, and at least one man was reportedly buried with an entire collection of them. This was material culture built around a genuine sense of style, not bare survival gear, not the absolute minimum required to make it through a harsh winter. These were deliberate choices made by people living in a landscape that offered no obvious explanation for where the underlying knowledge to produce any of it had actually come from. Then there were the objects placed beside the dead. Sprigs and small pouches of ephedra appear again and again across these graves, tucked in close against the bodies. The plant carries known pharmacological properties, and researchers have offered various readings of why it was placed there, whether medicinal or ceremonial in nature. Though those remain interpretations built from context rather than anything the people themselves left behind to confirm directly, what can be stated plainly without speculation is that the placement was clearly deliberate, and it was repeated consistently across the entire cemetery, generation after generation. This wasn't a passing curiosity that could simply be noted and set aside. It was a genuine, substantial problem for the field, because these people were living deep inside the Tarim Basin more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road ever opened the region to long-distance trade. Centuries before Han Chinese populations established themselves there, well before the Uyghur populations who live in that same region today ever arrived. They predated nearly everyone the written historical record accounts for. And, to every researcher who examined them, they looked on the surface like they simply had no business being there at all. The scholar who did the most to bring these bodies to the attention of the wider world outside China was Victor Mayer, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who encountered them and found he genuinely could not let the question go. And it was the obvious question, the one anyone standing over a 4,000-year-old woman with red hair and a felt hat in the middle of a Chinese desert would immediately ask. How did people who looked like this end up in a place like this, and where on earth had they actually come from? The faces themselves seemed to demand a westward answer. Everything about the first impression pointed outward, toward migration, toward some long journey from a distant homeland that had carried these people, along with their looms and their hats, across half a continent to eventually die in that sand. It seemed almost self-evident at the time. Faces that were visibly out of place had to mean movement from somewhere else entirely, and so, for decades, that's exactly what the leading theories in the field set out to explain. Not whether these people had migrated in from elsewhere. That part was treated as settled before anyone had even started building a case. The only real disagreement among researchers was which specific road they had taken to get there. Every serious theory circulating at the time started from that same underlying assumption that these people had come from somewhere else. One explanation pointed north toward the Afanasyevo, a Bronze Age herding culture originating out of the steppe country around the Altai Mountains. In this version, associated with the work of researchers, including J.P., Mallory and Victor Mayer himself, the Tarim population descended from steppe migrants who pushed southward into the basin, potentially carrying with them Tocharian, an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family that would later be directly attested in written form in that same region. It was, on its face, a clean and satisfying story. Herders move. Herders spread outward. The language and the physical features travel together, down out of the mountains and into the sand. A second competing explanation looked instead toward the southwest, toward Central Asia, and specifically toward the sophisticated oasis civilization known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, a network of irrigated settlements considerably more advanced than a simple herding culture. In this version, the earliest Tarim inhabitants arrived from those societies, bringing farming knowledge and craft techniques with them. A third theory pointed toward the broader inner Asian mountain corridor, the long string of high valleys and pastures that could plausibly have funneled populations down into the basin from both the north and the west simultaneously. 3 separate theories, 3 entirely different maps, and every single one of them drew its arrow pointing inward toward the Tarim Basin from somewhere outside it. The genetic evidence available at the time only muddied the picture further rather than clarifying it. Samples reportedly smuggled out of the country in the early 1990s were said to show links to European ancestry. Later, a research team reported a considerably more mixed picture during the 2000s, one that appeared to include both East Asian and even South Asian genetic markers among the remains. That specific finding was disputed by other researchers in the field, including Mayer himself, and the overall evidentiary picture never fully settled, leaving a set of partial, conflicting results pointing in several directions at once and resolving into no clear consensus at all. There was also a second reason this particular question sat unresolved for so long, and it had nothing to do with the underlying science. The mummies had become genuinely political. To many Uyghur communities living in the region today, these ancient bodies were regarded as ancestors, and their presence in the Tarim Basin was taken by some as evidence supporting a claim of prior, deeper-rootedness in that land, predating later populations. The Chinese state grew visibly wary of exactly that line of argument, and access to the physical remains tightened considerably over subsequent years. Foreign researchers found it increasingly difficult to study the bodies directly, and the underlying science became entangled with a much larger, ongoing dispute over regional identity and belonging. That dispute is not something this account is in any position to resolve, and it's worth stating plainly that the archaeology itself and the modern political arguments surrounding it are 2 genuinely separate questions that became very difficult in practice to keep cleanly apart from each other, but the practical, on-the-ground consequence was straightforward enough to state directly. The one test that could have actually settled the scientific argument was, for a long stretch of time, the one test almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers was in any real position to run. So this was the state of the field as the 21st century opened. A world-famous archaeological mystery, a set of visually striking bodies with unmistakably Western-looking features, lying preserved in a Chinese desert. Several competing migration theories, each proposing a different homeland and a different specific route. Every single one of them assumed from the outset that these people were relatively recent newcomers to the region. Decades of scholarly argument conducted almost entirely on the visible surface of the problem, on the shape of a nose, the weave pattern of a piece of cloth, the geography of a particular mountain pass, and underneath all of it, a set of physical remains that almost no researcher outside China had been permitted to test using the one tool that might have actually settled the matter conclusively. The question of where the Tarim people originally came from had been argued over for the better part of a century without any real resolution, and it kept being argued in the exact same terms every single time, because those visible, surface-level terms were the only ones available. What the field genuinely needed was a way to read the answer directly out of the bodies themselves, out of the one record that couldn't be argued or interpreted into a homeland it didn't actually possess. That record was their DNA, and for the better part of 40 years, it had simply never been properly read. The answer finally arrived in October of 2021, published in the journal Nature under the title, "The Genomic Origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin Mummies." The paper was led by researchers Fan Zhang and Chao Ning, working as part of a large international team that included senior authors Christina Warrener, an anthropologist affiliated with Harvard University, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, Chungwan Zhong, an evolutionary geneticist, and Yinqiu Kuei, who led the Chinese side of the research. For the very first time, someone was going to read the founding population of the Tarim Basin directly out of their own genomes rather than out of the shape of their skulls or the pattern of their clothing. The scope of the study was deliberately careful, and it matters that it was, because sweeping claims built on thin evidence are exactly what had kept this question unresolved for so long in the first place. The research team recovered genome-wide data from 13 of the earliest known individuals in the basin, 11 of them drawn directly from the Yaohe Cemetery itself, with 5 additional individuals recovered from the neighboring Dzungarian Basin further to the north. These were not scattered latecomers who happened to wander into the region at the tail end of the story and get buried on top of everyone else. They were among the oldest people the entire region has ever produced, dating to roughly the early second millennium before the Common Era. These were the founders, the very people every competing theory had spent a full century trying to explain. The underlying logic going into the analysis was straightforward, and Zhong laid it out plainly in the research. Where there is genuine migration, there are genes to prove it. If these people had truly arrived from the West, from the Afanasyevo steppe culture, from the Central Asian oasis civilizations, from the mountain corridor, from anywhere at all, that specific homeland would have left a clear, detectable signature written directly into their DNA. Populations simply do not move across a continent without carrying themselves, genetically, along with them. Find that signature in the data, and you find the exact road they had traveled to get there. All the research team had to do was read it accurately. The road did not exist. There was no detectable Afanasyevo-related ancestry anywhere in these individuals, no step signal, none of the genetic fingerprints that a real migration from the West or the North would have stamped permanently into their DNA showed up anywhere in the data. 3 separate theories had spent decades arguing over which specific journey these people had made. The genomes came back with a verdict that fit none of them, not a weaker version of one theory. not some reasonable compromise between two. None of them at all, because the Tarim founders had never come from anywhere else in the first place. They were a genetically isolated local population, descended directly from people who had already been living in and around that exact region since the early Holocene, thousands of years before those specific graves were ever dug, before the boat-shaped coffins, before the felt hats, before the woven cloth. They weren't travelers who happened to end up settling in the Tarim Basin. They were the Tarim Basin, and they had been there the entire time. The genetic composition itself turned out to be genuinely striking in its simplicity. Roughly 72% of their ancestry traced back to a lineage geneticists refer to as ancient North Eurasian. The remaining 28% came from an ancient Northeast Asian source population, two ingredients, that is, the entire recipe. No detectable European contribution, no steppe herders folded into the mix, no Central Asian oasis farmers blended in either. And here is the detail genuinely worth sitting with. All around them, during that exact same Bronze Age period, neighboring populations across the wider region were mixing freely with one another, trading genes back and forth in every direction the map allowed. People met, intermarried, absorbed each other, and moved on together. That is essentially what the Bronze Age looks like almost everywhere researchers have sampled it across the ancient world. The Tarim population was not doing any of that. They sat directly in the middle of all of that surrounding movement and remained genetically sealed off, marrying almost exclusively among themselves, absorbing essentially no outside ancestry. Generation after generation, while trade and migration traffic flowed around them on every side, they held onto their own bloodline and let almost nothing new in. A genetic island sitting in the middle of a landscape full of constant traffic. So the genomes didn't simply answer the question that had been asked for a full century. They erased the question outright. There was no migration route left to trace, because there had never been an arrival to trace in the first place. The specific migration everyone had spent decades carefully mapping had simply never happened. But that finding only sharpened the real underlying mystery into something considerably harder to explain. Because if these people had never actually arrived from anywhere, their strikingly Western-looking faces still demanded some kind of explanation. The question was no longer where these people had traveled from. It became instead who they were actually descended from. That answer runs back to a population that has almost entirely vanished from the modern human genetic record. Geneticists refer to them as the ancient North Eurasians, hunter-gatherers who lived across the Siberian interior during the depths of the last ice age, a people who spread widely across the frozen heart of the continent, and then, as the glaciers eventually retreated, largely faded out of the genetic record almost everywhere they had once lived. For a long time, researchers didn't even know for certain that this population had ever existed at all. They were essentially a gap, a shape that other, better documented populations seemed to statistically require in order to explain their own ancestry, but a population that had never actually been directly observed or confirmed, an absence you could only detect indirectly by the hole it left behind in everyone else's genetic makeup. Then, a single body gave that missing population a face. Near Lake Baikal in Siberia lies a site called Malta, and buried there was the body of a child, a boy who died roughly 24,000 years ago, right at the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets still covered enormous stretches of the northern world. His remains had actually been recovered decades earlier, back in the 1920s. And sat quietly in a museum collection for years, waiting for a question that hadn't even been formulated yet. It was eventually a research team led by Eske Willerslev in Copenhagen that successfully sequenced his genome and published the results. The boy, now generally referred to in the scientific literature as MA1, turned out to belong to precisely the population researchers had long suspected existed, but had never been able to directly confirm. A ghost, finally made real. The reason researchers call this a ghost population specifically is that it left behind almost no fully intact modern descendants, and yet fragments of its DNA are scattered widely across the modern world today. A substantial share of Native American ancestry traces directly back to this same source population, by some estimates, somewhere between roughly 14 and 38%. A meaningful share of the ancestry of many modern European populations traces back to that exact same source as well. This vanished Ice Age population managed to thread its genetic legacy into populations living on opposite sides of the entire planet, populations that never met each other and never directly mixed with one another, and then the source population itself simply disappeared, surviving today mostly as scattered fragments carried inside other entirely different populations. And this is precisely what the Tarim mummies turned out to actually be. Not strangers who had traveled in from somewhere far to the west, but among the best surviving direct representatives of that same lost lineage found anywhere on Earth. An isolated pocket of an Ice Age ghost population, preserved by pure chemical accident in the sand of a Chinese desert, thousands of years after the wider population that had originally produced them, had already vanished from nearly everywhere else on the planet. The faces that had looked so strikingly out of place for an entire century were never actually out of place at all. They were simply old, considerably older than any migration theory had ever reached back far enough to account for a deep, unbroken survival that the desert simply happened to preserve by accident. And then there is the genuine paradox that this same study uncovered, because these people turned out to be sealed off by blood while simultaneously being wide open by culture. Their teeth told part of that story directly. Traces of milk proteins preserved in hardened dental plaque showed they had been dairy herders from the very beginning of their presence in the region. Their diet braided together influences from across the entire breadth of Eurasia at once. Wheat and dairy products that ultimately originated in West Asia, millet that originated far to the east, ephedra drawn from Central Asian traditions. They borrowed farming techniques, herding practices, and medicinal knowledge from every direction the compass had to offer, and yet they married essentially none of the people who had originally brought any of it to them. They absorbed the wider world's available technology and knowledge while keeping their own bloodline almost entirely untouched across many generations. Isolation and cosmopolitanism, two concepts that sound like direct opposites of one another, turn out in this specific case to describe the exact same population at the exact same moment in time. What people choose to borrow from their neighbors, and who the people actually are by direct descent, turn out to be two genuinely separate historical records. But this genetic answer didn't close every open question surrounding the Tarim mummies, and it's worth being honest about exactly what still remains unresolved. The matter of language, for instance, is still an open question. Whether these specific people actually spoke an early form of Tocharian cannot be established directly from DNA evidence alone. Researcher Elizabeth Wayland Barber has specifically cautioned against simply assuming that they did, pointing to a gap of roughly 1,000 years separating these particular mummies from the first directly attested examples of the Tocharian language in the historical record, more than enough time for a language to arrive in a region through cultural contact without the underlying population itself changing at all. Other researchers, including linguist Ronald Kim, have argued the timing could still plausibly fit together, and the original 2021 study, careful as it was, ultimately sampled essentially one specific time horizon at one particular site. As geneticist Vagish Narasimhan has noted publicly, considerably wider sampling across the broader Tarim Basin could still meaningfully complicate this picture going forward. The beginning of this story is now genuinely certain. The middle and the end of it are still actively being read. return in the end to the desert itself and to the bodies it has kept intact for so long. The beauty of Lulan, the beauty of Xiaohe. Faces still intact after 3,000 and 4,000 years respectively, still wearing their felt hats, still framed by hair the color of straw and rust. For an entire century, they were treated as strangers who had wandered in from somewhere far away, a mystery of migration patiently waiting to be traced back to its origin point. Their own DNA revealed something considerably stranger than that. They were never travelers who arrived from elsewhere at all. They were survivors who simply stayed long after the wider world that had originally produced them had already vanished almost everywhere else. The last known remnant of a ghost lineage from the depths of the Ice Age, a population that now survives mostly as scattered fragments of genetic code carried quietly inside billions of people alive today and almost nowhere else on Earth as a complete, intact population in its own right. And the desert, by every indication, still holds a great deal that it has not yet chosen to give up.